Footage used in deep cuts is owned entirely by the copyright holders. Deep Cuts makes no claim of ownership and simply uses the footage for purposes of education, commentary, and criticism under fair use. Please support filmmakers and the art of filmmaking by watching this film in its entirety on home media or streaming services where available. Hello and welcome to Deep Cuts, a show dedicated to exploring the good, the bad, and the gory in all your favorite horror movies. I'm your host, Matthew Bolton, and today we're visiting Springwood, Ohio to explore the seminal horror film that turned New Line Cinema into the house that Freddy built, with Wes Craven's 1984 genre-bending slasher flick, A Nightmare on Elm Street. After reading a few LA Times articles about young men dying in their sleep, and after a chance encounter with a creep outside his window as a kid, master of horror Wes Craven created the character of Freddy Kruger, a man who tortures and kills the children of the people who murdered him while they sleep, bringing us one of the greatest horror icons with the most famous murder weapon in movie history. And although his later films would turn Freddy's character into more of a cartoon, the first three films were focused on scaring audiences and featured masterful performances by classically trained actor Robert Englund. And just how much does this film keep us clutching our Mr. Coffees? Well, let's get ready for bed and find out. The movie opens with a montage of Freddy's iconic glove being created, just before jumping into a dream sequence that introduces one of our protagonists, Tina Gray, as she fake runs away from Freddy in his boiler room. We catch glimpses of the film's villain throughout a very long sequence until he's finally able to catch up to Tina. And most likely it's because she's running away like this. Freddy closes in on Tina, but not before Tina screams, giving us a great piece of sound design. Her screams scare off Freddy, and Tina starts to make her way out of the dead end when holy shit! Tina snaps out of her nightmare, and her mother bursts in, wondering what's going on. Tina says it was just a dream, but her mother points out that it must have been some hell of a dream since her nightgown is tore up from the floor up, son. We hear young girls singing Freddy's famous jump rope song, 1, 2, Freddy's Coming For You, which I can't actually play here due to copyright. But this movie has been out for a couple of decades, so feel free to Google it, I guess? We then see Tina pull up to school with her friend and main protagonist of the story, Nancy, plus male counterpart, Johnny Depp. There's no joke there. The group all talk about their weird dreams from the night before, and Tina's macho, on-again, off-again boyfriend, Rod, joins them with some leftover testosterone on his leather jacket from breakfast.
I had a hard-on this morning when I woke up, Tina. Had your name written all over it.
There's 4 letters in my name, Rod. How could there be room on your joint for 4 letters?
Burn!
He has to go clean that off before it stains, and the group continues to keep talking about their weird dreams before they all make their way into class. Later that night, Nancy, Tina, and Glenn, sit around talking about their dreams some more. Nancy and Tina begin to think that they're dreaming about the same scary guy. Glenn says that's impossible before the group is startled by a noise coming from the backyard. They all go out there to investigate the sound, and Glenn tries to play it tough.
I'm gonna punch out your ugly lights, whoever you are.
Rod jumps out of the darkness, tackling Glenn, scaring everyone in the process and proving to all of us he's the tough guy of the group. Tina and Rod decide to go inside and destroy Tina's mom's bedroom with some sexual Olympics, but Nancy shuts Glenn down, leaving him alone on the couch. After all the sexing, Rod tells Tina that he too had similar nightmares before they both drift off to sleep. Later, Tina is woken up by the sound of stones hitting her window and gets up to take a closer look. In one of the coolest shots of the franchise, Freddy starts to push himself through the wall above Nancy sleeping in Tina's room. The 2010 remake used a computer-generated version of the same effect, and it really just falls short. If you can do it practically, do it practically. Nancy sits up and places the fallen crucifix back on the wall, then rolls back over in bed as Tina makes her way into the backyard to see who's there. She hears somebody calling her name from the back alley and walks out to see who it is. Once out there, a trash can lid rolls up, startling Tina into turning around. She sees a creepy Freddy shadow against the wall before Freddy fully reveals himself with crazy stretch arms. We then get some fun pyrotechnics and one of the best Freddy quotes of the entire series.
Please, God.
This is God.
The chase is on, and Tina fake runs away from a much shorter version of Freddy, almost like she's trying to make a young kid feel like they're fast enough to catch her until holy shit, the real Freddy shows up! Even though Freddy is right on her tail chasing her back into the yard, Tina is able to put some distance between the two of them, at least until Freddy jumps out from behind a tree like a magical elf, just to chop off 2 of his fingers. Ugh. Freddy catches up with Tina at her back door, and the two tumble over a breakaway table, and we get a signature Wes Craven shot from the victim's point of view as they rip the face off their killer. This same shot would be used in Scream 12 years later. Rod wakes up to Tina tossing and turning in her sleep and yanks the sheets off of her to see that she's alone, just before 4 large gashes appear on her chest, followed by pools of blood. For a franchise's first kill, this scene is hands down one of my favorite in the series, outside of Jennifer and Philip's deaths from part 3, but we'll cover that movie in a future episode. Tina is dragged up the wall and across the ceiling while Rod is knocked down and helpless watching it all. Nancy and Glenn wake up from the screams and come running to the door, but it's locked from the inside. By the time Gilbert Grape is able to break in the door, Tina is dead as shit and Rod is nowhere to be found. Later at the police station, Lieutenant Thompson is being briefed by Sergeant Parker, played by Joseph Whipp, who would go on to play the sheriff in Scream. Lieutenant Thompson greets Nancy and Marge, who seemingly crawled out of a bottle just to be there, and gets right to the blame game. First blaming Marge for letting Nancy be there, then Nancy for being there in the first place. Then Rod for being a lunatic. Nancy tries to explain everything, but the adults just aren't listening.
Maybe you don't think murder is serious.
How can you say I don't take her death seriously?
The parents chill out for a second and give Nancy a shot to explain. She then tells them about how Tina dreamt of a man with knives for fingers that was going to kill her. We get no resolution in this scene before a long dissolve takes us into the next morning, where Marge is already 3 sheets to the wind and refilling her screwdriver with vodka. There is 0 orange juice in that glass though. Alcoholism is a serious problem, kids. Marge watches a news report that reminds us of what happened the night before, but turns it off when she notices Nancy is coming. She tries to get Nancy to stay home from school, but Nancy says, "Drink up, Mom," and takes off. As Nancy is walking to school, she's pulled into the bushes by Rod, who tells her that he's innocent just as Lieutenant Thompson and the entire police force comes in to arrest him. Nancy is understandably pissed that her dad would use her as bait to catch a killer, and tells him to get fucked before she bails for school. Later in Lynn Shay's English class, Nancy falls asleep and sees Bodybag Tina in the hallway calling to her. No one else can see what's happening, so naturally, Nancy leaves class to follow Tina's trail of blood. This scene has always stuck with me since watching the film. Something about Tina and the body bag being dragged by an invisible force has definitely always made the hairs on my neck stand up. Nancy tries to keep up with Tina and runs into a hall monitor wearing a very familiar sweater and finger knife glove.
No running in the hallway.
Nancy then runs down into a restricted area that becomes Freddy's boiler room. She calls out for Tina, but only gets a maggot-filled Freddy instead. Nancy tries to run out of there, but quickly finds herself in a dead end, cornered by Freddy. It always makes me laugh how Freddy could have killed Nancy in seconds, but instead takes the longest walk down a corridor I have ever seen, accompanied by a synth tongue wiggle. In order to wake herself up, Nancy burns herself against a hot pipe, waking up in class screaming. Her teacher tries to calm her down. If only that teacher knew some sort of way to have an out-of-body experience, to maybe fight Freddy in his own turf in his realm? Get at me, New Line Cinema and James Wan, because that's a movie I'd gladly pay to see! After leaving class, Nancy notices that the burn from the steam pipe in the dream world is actually still on her arm in the real world, and starts to connect a few dots before running to chat with Rod in his holding cell. She tries to get the truth out of Rod about what happened to Tina, and he continues to claim his innocence. Understandably, Nancy gets creeped out when Rod mentions that he's had similar dreams to what she's having with Freddy. Later, Nancy sits in the tub singing Springwood's latest hit song, the Freddy Rhyme, as she starts to drift off. Freddy's glove rises out of the water like a shark fin from Jaws and stalls just enough for Marge to wake Nancy up. Marge tells Nancy that people drown in the bathtub all the time, and Nancy blows her off before she literally falls back asleep, being pulled underneath the water by Freddy. Nancy struggles to get out, but wakes herself up in the process, escaping Freddy's grasp once again. This is the first time that we actually see Nancy start taking stay-awake pills, and later she watches Evil Dead in her room and is scared when Ed Wood tries to break through her window. Nancy asks Glenn to stand watch while she goes to sleep in order to look for Freddy. He agrees and they cut the lights, dissolving us into Dream World. In the Dream World, Nancy makes her way to the police station to check on Rod, and sees Freddy walk through the bars into Rod's cell. She calls out to Glenn to wake her up, but it's no use. Glenn is asleep as fuck. Tina shows up and is all gross, spitting out a centipede and has disgusting fucking feet. Nancy walks around the side of the police station calling out for Glenn to wake her up, but only gets a great Freddy jump scare instead. A chase ensues, and for one of the first times in cinema, a knocked over trash can gives the victim a fighting chance of escaping. Once back at her house, Nancy makes her way upstairs, but gets stuck on the sticky nightmare steps, making her way to her bedroom. Freddy breaks in the small window at the front door and taunts Nancy with a terrible Tina mask.
Save me from Freddy!
Nancy finally makes it into her room and locks the door behind her. Glenn is asleep in the corner while Nancy tries to convince herself that this is all just a dream. While she's trying to convince herself, Freddy jumps through the mirror directly in front of Nancy, knocking the two onto the bed. They wrestle around a bit and have a bitchin' pillow fight before Nancy's fail-safe alarm clock saves the day. She immediately berates Glenn for being a dumbass, and Marge bursts in. Nancy tells her it's fine, so Marge goes off to crawl back into her bottle. After, Nancy notices that a feather from her dream pillow fight is drifting out of the window, and she and Glenn run over to the police station to check on Rod. Unfortunately for Rod, though, they can't get to him fast enough, and he's hung by the most phallic set of sheets in town. We then jump to Rod's funeral, and everyone is there. After, Nancy describes Freddy to her parents, and they both turn white before they shut her up and shove her into the car. Dad suggests that maybe she stay home for a few days, but Marge has better plans.
I've got something better. I'm going to get her some help.
Marge takes Nancy to the Katja Institute for the Study of Sleep Disorders, which is a long enough name to justify this insanely long zoom shot so you have time to read it all. Inside, Nancy reluctantly agrees to take part of a sleep study, and the mood lighting turns to full James Cameron mode as everything goes blue. Marge and the doc sit and talk about dreams and how they're medically a mystery. Yet earlier, he definitely knew that if you didn't dream, you were gonna go cuckoo. Just when the doctor says things are looking normal, Nancy begins to scream and roll around in her sleep. The staff and Marge then run in and turn on the lights to wake Nancy, who's actually already awake, and she brought back a few fun souvenirs from her nightmare. A couple of fresh gashes on her arm, a new do, and Freddy's hat, which hilariously we'll come to find in the next day, has his name written inside. Like, is there a lost and found out there for horror movie villains somewhere? The next day in the kitchen, Marge slaps the shit out of Nancy before admitting that she actually knows who Fred Kruger is. Nancy breaks Marge's breakfast booze and storms out to Venice Beach, California, where she and Crybaby talk about dreams and how to defeat the evil within them. Nancy later returns to her home to find out that all of the house's windows have bars on them and that she's now going to be stuck as a prisoner inside her own home. Once inside, Marge comes out to explain, with an entrance that rivals most of Freddy's.
Mother!
Marge invites Nancy down to the basement to tell her about Fred Kruger, a child murderer who Marge and a bunch of the other parents burned to death when he was found not guilty of killing kids. She tells Nancy that she has nothing to worry about because Marge killed him, and like any other good murderer, Marge kept a souvenir of her kill, Freddy's finger knives. In a deleted part of the scene, Nancy actually was told that she had a sibling who was murdered by Fred, which would have been a really cool layer to this movie. Later, Nancy calls Glenn, and the two hatch a plan to kill Freddy once and for all. They plan to have Nancy play the bait, and for Glenn to whack the shit out of Freddy with a baseball bat when Nancy pulls him out of the dream world into the real world. Glenn agrees and sits in bed watching TV and listening to music, as Marge creepily puts Nancy to bed.
The nightmare's over, please. Okay.
Nancy gets up and tries to call Glenn, who she thinks fell asleep. Unfortunately for Glenn, his parents answer hanging up on Nancy, and Nancy destroys her phone in the process. And when Nancy tries to run out the door to wake Glenn, the phone rings, and Freddy gives Nancy some of that sweet sugar.
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
Nancy then tries to run out of the house to go warn Glenn, but Marge has locked her inside the house, and she's going nowhere. And unfortunately for Glenn over at his house, passing out is one of his main character traits, as Freddy's arms shoot out of the bed to pull him in. This is another amazing death scene that really makes A Nightmare on Elm Street stand out in the horror genre. The sequence was shot by turning the entire room upside down on a gyro set and sending the blood down through the bed. Heather Langenkamp and Robert Englund were on set to watch the actual experience, and unfortunately, the gyro turned the wrong way, and a lot of that blood rushed out of the room, which you can actually see in the take, and hit some electrical cables, making a pretty dangerous situation for the people on set. Fortunately, Englund was there and pulled Langenkamp away safely before anything serious could have happened. Emergency responders show up, including Lieutenant Thompson, who gets a call from Nancy next door. She tells her dad to come back over and fill Glenn's shoes in her plan to kill Freddy. Lieutenant Thompson, not really believing her, puts a patrolman on Nancy's house and goes upstairs to see the crime scene. Nancy then sets up a bunch of booby traps for Freddy ahead of going to sleep in a pretty cool montage. Lieutenant Thompson walks into the crime scene in Glenn's room, and one of my favorite lines from the franchise is said.
What's the coroner got to say? He's in the jar puking since he saw it.
Nancy tucks her mom in and says goodbye as Marge puts down her bed booze and drifts off. Then Nancy goes to sleep herself. In her dream, Nancy walks through her house and into the basement to retrieve Freddy's glove, only it's not where Marge left it. She finds passage into Freddy's boiler room and in a creepy display of sound design, hears all of her friends' deaths playing out just for her. She then makes her way to Freddy's bedroom where she sees some of her friends' things on his bed. After finding Glenn's headphones, Nancy has had enough and calls out to Kruger, only for him to appear and throw her out of his boiler room onto a very noticeable crash pad in Nancy's front yard. Kruger appears and Nancy tackles him, hoping he'll come back into her world, but unfortunately for Nancy, her plan didn't— Holy shit, it worked! The two tumble around a bit, and Freddy pretty much runs into all of Nancy's traps, as Nancy tries to call to her father for help. They eventually make their way to the basement, where Nancy lights Freddy on fire, giving us an incredible fire burn and stairfall to boot. Lieutenant Thompson finally makes his way over to the house and breaks the door in with a few deputies. And the deputies go down to the basement while Lieutenant Thompson and Nancy follow the dope-ass flaming footsteps upstairs into Marge's room. Once inside, Nancy cracks a chair over Freddy's back while he attacks Marge on the bed, still on fire, which is dope! Lieutenant Thompson puts out the fire by covering both of them with a blanket, and when it's removed, only Marge is there and her body drifts down into the bed into an abyss. Nancy and Lieutenant Thompson come to an understanding, and Lieutenant Thompson goes back downstairs to talk to his deputies. And in another great example of practical special effects, Freddy stretches his way out of the bed to attack Nancy. Only this time, Nancy knows she needs to take back his power by turning her back to him and taking back every bit of energy she ever gave to him. Even though this is kind of a weird ending, Freddy lunges at her and pretty much sparkles away into nothingness. We then cut to a new day in a very dreamy and foggy front porch outside of Nancy's house, as Marge sends her off for a day with all of her friends, now back from the dead. And everything seems to have returned to normal. At least until the car turns into a Freddy-colored trap that sends the teens down the road screaming in fear past the Freddy girls as they sing our favorite little jingle. We then cut back to a terrible dummy of Marge as she's pulled in through the small window of the front door at Nancy's house. Freddy's laughs bring us into the film's credits, and that's all she wrote. And there you have it, 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street. The film would go on to spawn 8 sequels, including a crossover and a reboot, 2 seasons of a TV series, a video game, comics, and a huge impact on pop culture. Freddy Krueger continues to be one of the most recognizable faces in the world. I've always loved the Nightmare franchise and everything it's offered to horror fans throughout the years, and I can't wait to cover future films on this channel. Whether you love him or hate him, Freddy has earned his place in horror history and has the ultimate reason to stay awake at night. Join me next week where I explore the movie that started it all for horror director George A. Romero with 1968's Night of the Living Dead. Until then, I'm Matthew Bolton, and this has been Deep Cuts. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Deep Cuts. Let me know in the comments below what you think of A Nightmare on Elm Street and what your favorite movie or kill is in the franchise. And I'll see you next week. Stay screaming.